This is part two of the presentation on the market revolution. The market revolution had major consequences for American society, for where people lived, for how they lived. This is a chart of urbanization in the U.S. Now, what that means, the way this is set up, is the line that you see here is the percentage of all Americans who live in cities. Well, in 1790, not long after the Revolution, it's about 5%. So one out of every 20 Americans lived in a city. And by the middle of the 19th century, shortly before the Civil War, it passed 15%. Uh, and when you get just past the Civil War, it gets to 20%. That's a huge increase. That's a fourfold increase in that period of 70 years. And then you can see how this continues so that in recent times we have about 75% of Americans who live in cities. And at this point, that would include suburbs. They are cities also. Now, this had consequences. It meant America was gradually becoming no longer a primarily agricultural society, but a manufacturing society, an urban society, one that whose economy is much more complex. Now, as workers left the farm and worked in early factories, they found that the working conditions and wages and hours were extremely harsh. And at this point, unions began to form. These are workers banding together so that they can have more power as a group than they would have as individuals. Their employers were powerful, they were unified, and workers tried to level the playing field and gain some more leverage, more clout in dealing with their employers. Um, now, this was, as I said, a response to low wages, to poor working conditions, to long hours, but it was also a response to what you could call an industrial work culture. Um, Before that, what you could call a pre-industrial work culture was much more relaxed. You didn't have to be at work precisely on time. There were no clocks in a lot of farms. You got up with the sun. You did what had to be done. You took breaks when you needed them. All of that changed for workers, for example, in textile mills. They had to be up at a certain time. When that bell rang, they had to be at their jobs working. If they were even 5 minutes late, there were consequences. They took breaks only when their employers said they could, and those breaks were few and far between. They worked sometimes 13, 14 hours a day, and that just wasn't a style of work that they were used to. Um, it's hard to imagine anybody getting used to that. And they often rebelled against it. Um, and from 1834 to 36, there were more than 150 strikes by workers whose lives had been turned upside down by these new working conditions. The major goals of unions were a number of things. They wanted to make society better. They wanted a free public education. Public schools were not too widely available at this time in America. They wanted an end to imprisonment for debt, where you could be locked up if you hadn't paid your debts. They wanted a 10-hour day. Now notice, they didn't want an end to the 10-hour day. They wanted an end to the 12 or 14-hour day. So a 10-hour day was a goal. Now 10 hours would seem like a very long time. More common is an 8-hour day. But they would have settled for a 10-hour day. But for the most part, they weren't able to get it during this period. They were hurt by court rulings, for one thing. The courts very often held that a union was a conspiracy, that it was illegal, because people were working together uh, and not dealing with their employers as individuals. Well, um, today this has been protected by law for the most part, but in those days, a lot of union activity was illegal. There were financial panics also, horribly disastrous economies. And when that happened, workers lost their leverage. They didn't have much bargaining power because employers could just say, "Well, there are a lot of unemployed people out here. If you don't like your job, if you don't like your wages, if you don't like anything about your job, take a hike. We'll get somebody else." Now, the living conditions for many of these workers were extremely poor as well. They weren't paid enough to afford decent housing, and you have a lot of overcrowding. These are called tenements. A tenement is an apartment building for poor people. It usually involves very poor living conditions, a lot of overcrowding, poor sanitation, disease spreads in this kind of environment. A lot of children are put to work and therefore don't get an opportunity at education. Uh, the this was never as severe, never as strict as it was in Britain. But nevertheless, this was an extremely difficult life. And if you were a worker, certainly an immigrant who faced a whole other burden of discrimination, then your life was pretty grim. And a lot of the struggles that we'll be looking at in the next, you know, several weeks or months will involve workers trying to carve out a better life for themselves.